There is a statue at the bottom of Bristol Harbour. It went into the water on the 7th of June 2020, when a crowd pulled it from its plinth on Colston Avenue, dragged it through the streets, and dropped it into the floating harbour. The statue was of Edward Colston, a Bristol merchant who died in 1721, and who, across his lifetime, transported approximately 84,000 enslaved African people in the ships of the Royal African Company. Of those 84,000 people, approximately 19,000 died during the crossing. Their bodies were thrown into the Atlantic Ocean. The statue of the man who was responsible for this stood in the centre of Bristol for 125 years. The plaque on its base described him as a most virtuous and wise man, and one of the most deserving sons of the city. It took until 2020 for the statue to come down. What went into the harbour that day was not just a bronze figure. It was the physical representation of a 125-year argument about what Bristol chooses to remember and what it chooses to forget. That argument did not begin in 2020, and it has not ended since. In this video, we are counting down 13 scary facts about Bristol that most tourists never find out. Not the Bristol of Banksy and Brunel and the Christmas market on College Green, the Bristol of the slave trade and the cover-ups and the contamination and the political decisions that shaped this city in ways the tourist board has never found a way to put on a leaflet. Stay with me to the end, because number one is a fact about Bristol that has been in plain sight for over a century, that the city's most prominent institutions have known about, and that has only recently begun to be confronted with anything approaching honesty. So hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's begin. Edward Colston did not just give his name to a statue and an avenue and a school and a hall in Bristol. He gave his money to those institutions and others across the city, and the specific question of where that money came from and what the institutions that received it knew about its source is a question that Bristol's heritage establishment has been processing very slowly for a very long time. Colston gave to almshouses, to schools, to hospitals, and to churches across Bristol. The Colston's Girls' School and the Colston's Primary School both carry his name. The Colston Hall, Bristol's principal music venue, was renamed the Bristol Beacon in 2020, specifically to remove his name. The Society of Merchant Venturers, Bristol's oldest and most powerful business and philanthropic organisation, of which Colston was a member and eventually master, has administered charitable funds with Colston connections for centuries. Colston made his money in the Royal African Company, the company that held the monopoly on British slave trading from 1672 to 1698. The company transported approximately 100,000 enslaved people from West Africa to the Americas during its monopoly period. Colston's specific role in the company, as its deputy governor and as a major investor, made him directly and substantially responsible for the conditions under which those people were transported, and for the mortality rate during the crossings. The Bristol institutions that bear his name, or that have benefited from his philanthropy, received money that was generated by these specific activities. The question of what responsibility those institutions carry for acknowledging that fact, and what form acknowledgement should take, is one that Bristol has been debating with increasing urgency and decreasing consensus for the last 30 years. The Queen Square in Bristol is one of the finest Georgian public squares in Britain. Its elegant terraces, its central equestrian statue of William III, its formal garden, all represent the civic ambition of a city at the height of its commercial power in the early 18th century. Queen Square was built between 1699 and 1727, precisely the period during which Bristol was the leading slave trading port in Britain. The merchants whose wealth funded the construction of the square's elegant terraces were, in many cases, directly involved in the slave trade. The ships that left Bristol's harbour for West Africa and the Americas were financed by the people who lived in these houses. The wealth that paid for the architecture was generated by the transportation of enslaved human beings. This connection is documented. It is not disputed by historians. It is present in the city's archives in specific, named, traceable detail. The names of the merchants, the names of their ships, the routes of their voyages, the numbers of people transported, and the numbers who died. What is less present is this information in any form that the tourists who visit Queen Square encounter routinely. The heritage interpretation in and around Queen Square describes the architecture and the social history of the merchants who built it. The specific trade that generated the wealth for that architecture is present in the city's museums, but less consistently present in the streets where the architecture stands. Bristol is significantly better at acknowledging the slave trade than it was 30 years ago. The full integration of that acknowledgement into the everyday experience of the city's heritage, the interpretation visible to tourists walking the Georgian Quarter, remains incomplete. On the 2nd of April 1980, serious riots occurred in the St. Paul's district of Bristol. Police officers were injured, vehicles were burned, and property was damaged across several hours of sustained disorder. The riots were the first major urban civil disturbance in Britain since the 1950s. They preceded the Brixton and Toxteth riots of 1981 by over a year, making Bristol the first city in which the specific combination of factors that would produce those later disturbances had already combusted. The immediate trigger was a police raid on the Black and White Cafe on Grosvenor Road, a social centre for the St. Paul's community that police said was involved in unlicensed drinking and drug supply. The community's experience of the raid, and its experience of the policing that preceded it, was of aggressive and discriminatory law enforcement in a predominantly black community that had been subject to exactly this kind of policing for years. The Avon and Somerset Police's relationship with the St. Paul's community had been characterized by the use of the sus laws, the stop-and-search provisions that allowed police to stop anyone they suspected of intending to commit an offense, in ways that the community experienced as systematic racial harassment. The riots lasted several hours. 34 police officers and 17 members of the public were injured. The official response, as in Toxteth the following year, focused on the restoration of order rather than the structural conditions that had produced the disorder. The sus laws were repealed in the Criminal Attempts Act 1981, partly in response to the St. Paul's and subsequent riots. The structural relationship between Avon and Somerset Police and the St. Paul's community, and the question of whether the policing practices that preceded the riots were adequately reformed in their aftermath, has never been the subject of the kind of independent public inquiry that the Scarman Report provided for Brixton, or the Macpherson Report for Stephen Lawrence. The Clifton Suspension Bridge is one of the most beautiful and most photographed structures in Britain. Isambard Kingdom Brunel designed it. It spans the Avon Gorge at a height of approximately 75 metres above the high water mark of the River Avon. It is Bristol's most iconic image, appearing on thousands of postcards and in every piece of Visit Bristol promotional material. It is also the location of a significant number of suicides and suicide attempts every year, making it one of the most significant suicide sites in the United Kingdom. The Clifton Suspension Bridge Trust, which manages the bridge, has over many years installed safety measures. The high nets on the sides of the bridge, the CCTV cameras, the emergency phones, the staff trained to intervene. These measures have saved lives. The specific number of suicides and attempts at the bridge has been the subject of sustained research. The bridge's profile as a landmark, its visibility, and its height above the gorge are factors that researchers have identified as contributing to its specific significance as a suicide site. The conversation in Bristol about the bridge's role as a suicide site has, for most of the city's history, been conducted quietly and with the specific difficulty of discussing a painful reality about a beloved landmark. The decision about how much to publicly acknowledge the bridge's role in this context involves a genuine tension between the destigmatization of mental health discussion, which tends to support open acknowledgement, and the concerns about contagion effects and the potential impact of media coverage on suicide rates, which tend toward caution. The bridge is magnificent. The people who have died there deserve to be part of the conversation about what the bridge represents. Bristol's Harbourside is one of the most successfully regenerated urban waterfronts in Britain. The floating harbour, created by Brunel's father Mark Brunel in the early 19th century, now houses the SS Great Britain, the M Shed Museum, the Watershed Arts Centre, restaurants, bars, and a significant amount of new residential development. It is a destination, it is promoted, it is genuinely pleasant. The ground beneath it is another matter. The floating harbour and the surrounding land have a post-industrial contamination history that is significant, and that the regeneration process addressed to varying degrees in different parts of the harbour area. The gasworks that operated on the Harbourside for over a century left contaminated ground that required remediation before residential development could proceed. The industrial operations that preceded the regeneration, which included gas production, tar processing, chemical manufacture, and various heavy industrial processes, left a contamination legacy in the soil and in the harbour sediment that has not been uniformly or completely addressed. Environmental surveys conducted during the regeneration identified elevated levels of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, heavy metals, and other industrial contaminants in the ground beneath what is now residential and commercial development. The remediation standards applied varied across different parts of the development. The ongoing monitoring of harbour sediment has produced data that is publicly available in technical reports that most of the residents and visitors to the Harbourside will never read. What is in the ground beneath one of Bristol's most celebrated regeneration successes is documented in technical documents that are publicly accessible but not prominently communicated. In the Redcliffe area of Bristol, behind the church of St. Mary Redcliffe, which Elizabeth I described as the fairest, goodliest, and most famous parish church in England, stand two large brick warehouses that date from the 19th century. These are the Bristol tobacco bonds, former bonded warehouses where tobacco imported through Bristol's docks was stored under customs bond before duty was paid. The tobacco bonds are now converted to residential use, one of the city's more striking examples of industrial heritage conversion. What they represent, and what the conversion has not fully foregrounded, is Bristol's role as one of the most significant tobacco importing and processing ports in Britain throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. The wealth generated by Bristol's tobacco trade, like the wealth generated by the earlier slave trade, funded institutions, buildings, and philanthropy across the city. The connection between the tobacco trade, the conditions of the tobacco growers in Virginia and elsewhere, and the wealth that is embedded in Bristol's Victorian architecture is a connection that the city's heritage presentation addresses less consistently than the slave trade connection. The Virginia tobacco that was stored in the tobacco bonds was grown by enslaved people until 1865 and by extremely poorly paid sharecroppers thereafter. The Bristol merchants who imported that tobacco knew the conditions under which it was produced. The warehouses where it was stored are now attractive apartments. The connection between the apartments and the conditions under which the tobacco was grown is not part of the heritage interpretation of the conversion. And hey, before we reach the final five, if this video is showing you a Bristol that the city's tourist board has spent considerable effort making sure you experience, rather than think about, hit the like button and share it with someone who thinks they know this city, because what follows is the part of Bristol's story that its most beloved institutions have found most difficult to integrate into their self-presentation. Now, let's continue. Bristol Zoo, which operated on Clifton Down from 1836 until 2022, when it closed to transfer to a new site at Wild Place, was one of the oldest zoos in the world. It was also, for most of its history, an institution whose collection of animals was substantially built through the British imperial network, through colonial administrators, military officers, and commercial agents who acquired animals from the territories of the British Empire and transported them to Bristol. The specific conditions of that acquisition, the methods by which animals were captured, the mortality rates during transportation, and the involvement of colonial administration in facilitating the collection are documented in the zoo's historical records in ways that the zoo's public-facing identity did not routinely foreground. The Bristol Zoo Society's recent engagement with its imperial history as part of the broader Bristol conversations about colonial legacy triggered by the Colston events has begun to address this. The zoo's closure in 2022 and its transition to wild place provides an opportunity for a more thorough reckoning with the history of where the original collection came from and how. Whether that opportunity is taken remains to be seen. In the South Bristol district of Bedminster, the legacy of the lead smelting and processing industry that operated in the area for over a century has left a contamination history that is documented in environmental surveys, but that is not part of the South Bristol identity that the area presents to the world. The lead shot tower that operated in Bedminster was one of the most significant lead processing facilities in Britain. Lead shot manufacture, which requires dropping molten lead from height to form spherical pellets, was an industry that deposited lead in the surrounding environment through atmospheric emissions, through ground contamination around the facilities, and through the communities of workers who absorbed occupational exposure across generations of employment. The health consequences of lead exposure in the communities adjacent to lead smelting and processing operations were known, in general terms, before they were specifically documented for any particular facility. The communities that lived nearest to the lead operations were the communities that could not afford to live elsewhere. Environmental surveys of the Bedminster area have established elevated lead levels in soil that are a direct legacy of the lead processing industry. The long-term health consequences for the communities that lived adjacent to these operations have not been the subject of a comprehensive, independent public health study specific to South Bristol. The lead works are gone. The community that lived around them has not received a comprehensive account of what the industry that employed them also did to their health. The Bristol Channel has the second highest tidal range in the world. Between high and low tide, the water level in the channel can vary by as much as 15 meters. The specific hydrodynamics of the channel, the way its funnel shape concentrates the tidal flow, create conditions that have made it one of the most hazardous bodies of water in Britain throughout its recorded history. The Bristol Channel has claimed ships, cargo, and lives across 2,000 years of maritime use. The Welsh coast disasters of 1607, in which a wave or tsunami-like event killed an estimated 2,000 people along the Channel shores, is one of the most significant natural disasters in recorded British history. The specific use of the Channel as a dumping ground for waste from Bristol and the surrounding industrial areas across the 19th and 20th centuries is less prominently acknowledged. Industrial effluent, chemical waste, and various forms of contamination were discharged into the Channel during the industrial period, and the Channel's extraordinary tidal range, while it dilutes and disperses this material, does not eliminate its environmental consequences. The Channel's sediment carries the contamination record of 2 centuries of industrial discharge from Bristol and the other towns and cities on its shores. The fishing communities that worked the Channel during and after the industrial period were exposed to the contamination that the Channel received, and the fishing grounds that supplied Bristol's fish markets drew on waters that received industrial discharge. The environmental history of the Bristol Channel is documented in scientific literature that the tourism materials for the Channel's increasingly popular coastline do not reference. The University of Bristol is one of Britain's leading research universities, consistently ranked among the top institutions in the United Kingdom and internationally. It was founded in 1909 and has produced significant research across multiple disciplines across its history. Among the figures in its early history is Francis Galton, whose relationship with Bristol is indirect, but whose influence on British academic life in the early 20th century was direct and substantial. Galton, the founder of eugenics, the idea that human populations could be improved through selective breeding, influenced a significant body of academic research across British universities in the early decades of the 20th century. The University of Bristol, like many British universities, was an institution within which eugenicist thinking was present in academic research and in the ideological framework of certain academics across the early 20th century. The specific individuals at Bristol who engaged with eugenicist frameworks and the specific research they conducted is documented in the university's archives. The University of Bristol's formal engagement with this history, as part of the broader UK university sector's reckoning with the eugenics legacy in British academic institutions, began with the nationwide acknowledgement that institutions including University College London had engaged more directly with. Bristol's own engagement has been less prominent. The specific question of which research programs at Bristol were influenced by eugenicist thinking and what the relationship is between that research and the university's current academic identity has not received the same level of formal public engagement as some comparable institutions. Bristol has been celebrated as one of Britain's most successful cities of the 21st century. The creative economy, the tech sector, the cultural scene, the regenerated Harbourside, the university, the food culture, all have contributed to a Bristol that features consistently in quality of life rankings and that attracts significant in-migration from other British cities and internationally. The success is genuine. It is also unevenly distributed in ways that the promotional narrative tends to understate. The Barton Hill and Lawrence Hill areas of Bristol, in the east of the city, are among the most deprived communities in England. They contain concentrations of deprivation in health, education, employment, and housing that have remained relatively resistant to the economic growth that has transformed other parts of the city. The communities of Barton Hill and Lawrence Hill are predominantly black and minority ethnic, a demographic pattern that reflects the settlement history of Bristol's Caribbean and South Asian communities, and that is directly connected to the specific geographies of deprivation in a city whose economic growth has not been uniformly accessible to all its communities. The question of why Bristol's economic success has not reached Barton Hill and Lawrence Hill with the same effect that it has reached other parts of the city is a question that Bristol City Council and the various regeneration bodies that have operated in the city have been asking for decades without producing a satisfactory answer. The regeneration investments that have gone into these communities have not produced the outcomes that comparable investments have produced in other Bristol neighbourhoods. The reasons for this are complex and contested. The pattern is not. We began this video with the statue at the bottom of Bristol Harbour. We end with the full story of what that statue represented and what replacing or not replacing it says about the city that is still deciding. The statue of Edward Colston stood on Colston Avenue in Bristol from 1895 until June 7, 2020. For 125 years, the city of Bristol maintained in its central public space a monument to a man who transported 84,000 enslaved people and was responsible for the deaths of approximately 19,000 of them. The statue did not go up without opposition. Discussions about whether the statue's plaque should acknowledge Colston's slave trading rather than simply celebrating his philanthropy had been ongoing for at least 30 years before the statue came down. A revised plaque was proposed and debated for years. The Society of Merchant Venturers, whose members opposed changes to the plaque, was an obstacle to the revision for much of that period. The statue came down not through the process that had been debating for 30 years, but through the action of a crowd on a summer afternoon. What happened after the statue came down is as revealing as what happened to bring it down. The statue was recovered from the harbour and is now in the M Shed Museum, displayed with the ropes still around its neck and accompanied by interpretation that includes placards carried on the day it was removed. This is a genuinely thoughtful piece of curation. It presents the statue not as what it was for 125 years, a celebration, but as what it became on June 7, 2020, an artifact of a contested history. The empty plinth on Colston Avenue has hosted a series of temporary artworks while the permanent decision about what to put there is made. The empty plinth is, in some ways, the most honest thing Bristol has done. It acknowledges that the city has not yet resolved what it thinks about its own history. The resolution of that question, the genuine integration of the slave trade and all that followed it into Bristol's everyday understanding of itself, is work that has begun and is not finished. The statue is in the museum, the plinth is empty, the harbour is the same harbour that the slave ships left from, and Bristol is still deciding what kind of city it is.